Okay, cool. So we already did introductions. Yeah, I've been foraging for 5, 6 years or so seasonally. Most of it you're going to do during the winter and the spring. Again, I'm self-trained, kind of started out with Milo, have now been out with other people, and I also take people out and go over mushrooms. I'll go through this quickly just for the time, but I wanted to give you guys a chance to throw down kind of what you already know or think about mushrooms. There's a lot of rumors and misconceptions out there, so we probably won't have time for all you guys to type everything in. So I'll just go, I covered some of the more common misconceptions or things. So mushrooms are poisonous or dangerous. So let me backtrack for just a second. The purpose of this class is to give you an overview on all the mushrooms kind of that are around you here in California, what purpose they serve, and how to go about introducing yourself to this world. Not all mushrooms are toxic. In fact, the majority of them are not. However, I'll put a disclaimer on this right on the front. You should not do this course and then go out and just start randomly eating mushrooms. That is very dangerous. There are a couple of really, really toxic, deadly mushrooms that grow all over California that I will cover. And they can be really similar. A lot of the poisonings that happen are from immigrant families from like China and Thailand who are used to picking an edible mushroom in Asia that looks a lot like the death cap, for example. And so they just assume it's the same thing, which is very dangerous. You should never assume anything about mushrooms, especially when you don't know them. So just want to give out that caveat. You should always be with an experienced person when foraging mushrooms. You should only eat something once it's been identified, not just by you, but by someone else, and you have multiple points of identification. I'll go over that in a little more detail later, but I just wanted to give out a warning that this can be a dangerous activity when undertaken carelessly, but it can be perfectly safe and educational as long as you follow certain guidelines. So back to our misconceptions. Mushrooms are poisonous or dangerous. Handling them is not safe. They can be slimy or gross, and they are psychedelic, which involves a toxin or a poison. So I'm not going to answer all of these here, but the class will cover some of these. So here are kind of the basics of the mushroom. Mushroom it's neither plant or animal, it's a type of fungus, and it's from the kingdom fungi or fungi, which includes molds, yeast, and other things that I'm not going to cover in this course. What you commonly refer to as a mushroom is the fruiting body or sexual organ. It's how it reproduces that you see sticking up, usually above the ground. Sometimes they're buried, like truffles, which are a fungus. Again, sometimes they're growing under trees, in trees, etc. And you can see the basic structure here of how mushrooms start. Spores, you can think of spores as seeds. They're more simple structures than that and not the same exact thing. But essentially, this is how the mushroom propagates. The millions and millions of spores will blow out through the wind, usually coming down from the gills in a kind of classical mushroom. And then when they hit the right amount of moisture in the ground, they'll start to propagate, form hyphae. Those hyphae will join together and form mycelium. And what you'll get is this crazy looking white spider web underground, which I have photos of later, and you can see. And normally it's trying to stay away from like sunlight and oxygen and air. And so it'll stay underground until it finds the right conditions, right time of year, temperature, moisture, all these things are pretty important. And then that's when mushrooms will pop up. So when you are finding and picking a mushroom, it's similar to picking an apple off a tree in the sense that you're not hurting the original organism. The only thing you're doing if you get to a place where there's tons of mushrooms and you take all the mushrooms is you're just not leaving some for someone else, but you're not really damaging the organism or the environment as long as you're being careful about how you take them up. So certainly going in places you're not supposed to go, off trail where there's signs, trampling things, ripping things out and kind of not sort of replacing the soil there, like that's bad and you shouldn't do that. But in terms of damage to the organism, you're not doing anything bad to the organism by cutting out or pulling out the mushroom. And as you transport it, the spores, it's good to transport it in a basket or a mesh or something that's breathable, because as you carry them, they will continue to spread their spores. So you're actually helping the organism spread throughout the forest when you do that. Here is an example of a bunch of different types of fungus. I took most of these pictures and picked most of these mushrooms myself. So you have Top left, you have gills, tube mushrooms. That's where you can see the cross section. Boletes like the porcino are famous for this. Instead of actual gills, there's all these little tubules and the spores fall out of there. You have shelf mushrooms, often growing on tree in little shelves, they look like, mostly horizontally. Tooth, like the hedgehog, that's in the top right. You have cups, which are really interesting and varied. Corals, which often look like they belong underneath the sea, honestly. Most are edible. There's a few that are toxic, not really badly, but they won't be fun to eat. You have saddles, jelly there in the middle, and stomach, which means they're kind of shaped round and have content on the inside. So especially as they dry out, if you kind of squeeze those mushrooms, usually there's a hole in the top and they'll puff out a bunch of spores. And there's tons of cool videos online in slow motion where you can see that. So like I promised, here's a little bit more on mycelium. Minimize the camera here. So this is what you normally see underground. In these pictures, what someone did is probably turn over a leaf or pick up a log. And then the same way you would find a salamander oftentimes is where you're going to find mycelium. So you can see these feathery kind of spiderwebby structures. And these are really important. It's the main body of the fungus, and it's how it propagates, and also part of how it decomposes matter. Mushrooms don't photosynthesize like plants do. They don't have chlorophyll, so they can't take CO2 and make oxygen, and they can't produce sugar. That's one of the main differences between mushrooms and plants, aside from their cell structure. So they're neither consumers nor producers. They kind of take the role of bacteria. I think animal scavengers, bacteria, and fungus all provide, in different ways, provide the decomposition that happens in the forest, but everywhere else. And as you can see from that quote, if there were no device for decay, there would soon be no need for one. What that means is that we take for granted that dead tree life and plant life and everything that we're walking on in the substrate in the forest is just kind of, it's going to rot and decompose. But that doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? If you control for temperature and sterilize something and keep it in a vacuum and put a dead leaf in there, it's not going to decompose. You need bacteria and fungus and sometimes scavengers for those things to decompose. If they didn't exist, we would be buried in dead matter, essentially, and we'd have to continue building on top of that. So this is just part of the natural process and how nature kind of cleans up after itself. Couple of subdivisions here in mushrooms. So you have saprotrophic. These are mushrooms that feed on dead biomaterial. So you'll see them on cow patties, sometimes on dead animals. You'll see fungus growing over them or out of them. Mold is something that does this, wood, leaves, etc. And then you have biotrophic fungus, which is parasitic. So they're either growing out of wood or they feed on other mushrooms or insects, but they can go after live insects. There's a famous one in South America that does that. So those are kind of the two different things that fungus eats generally. Here's one of the things that's also happening underground with mycelium. So Myceliumycorrhizal, this comes from the Greek. Ecto is outside, myco is fungus or mushroom, and rhiza is roots. So I think there's an endomycorrhizal process as well, but I'll just describe this one. What's happening here is about 10% of plant species participate in this. And what's happening is the filaments of mycelium, which are, you can kind of think of them as the root system of fungus, are mixing in with the root systems of live plants. There are a few parasitic examples of this that are bad for the plant and will kill it, but the vast majority of these interactions are mutually beneficial for the plant and for the mushroom. And this is something that well-seasoned gardeners know. In fact, sometimes they'll implant spores or inoculate spores in their wood chips of mushrooms that are specifically beneficial for plants. And what's happening here is the mushroom is giving especially juvenile plants, certain nutrients it's not able to produce on its own. And in exchange, the mushroom is taking certain nutrients from the plants. So what you have is the mushrooms are mostly taking sugars from the plants that are produced through photosynthesis, which again, the mushrooms cannot do that. And in return, they're giving the plants water nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, which you'll recognize as some of the ingredients in any fertilizer that you go out and buy. So this is a natural way of helping fertilize plants. There's a lot of secondary things that happen as well. Mycelium tends to extend root systems. So this chemical communication that similar species of plants can do with each other in terms of warning each other about danger and things like that, it's extending that network further than it normally could. Also, any of the structural integrity that roots provide to the ground in riparian areas where it keeps erosion from happening when there's a lot of water, mycelium only helps with that, right? It's like, think of it as adding almost like a mesh around these roots, and it'll help contain soil even more. So that's another thing that happens underground that's really useful. Here's another example of mushroom anatomy. Top right here, you have a bunch of different mushrooms that I just picked at my mom's place in Katati, just to show you kind of the diversity of random mushrooms, just going out and picking them. Here's an Amanita in about this stage, in the secondary egg stage, where the mushroom cap has popped out, but you can still see the rest of the egg down here. Now, this is particular to Amanitas and other mushrooms that grow out of a shell or an egg. Not all mushrooms have these features, but you can still see in the final product a very recognizable mushroom, right? You can see the remnant of the scales at the top, the cap, gills, a little bit of remnant of the partial veil. This used to cover these gills, so it protects the gills until the mushroom is mature. And if you dig these up, like if you dig Amanitas up, often you will find this broken egg underground. I'll show you some other examples of that later. Okay, now here's a quick quiz for you guys. So I want to see where your instincts take you, and you don't have to be right, but type in order. So edible, toxic, medicinal. Which mushroom do you think is which? So for example, if you thought that they were edible, toxic, and medicinal from left to right, you would just say A, B, C, etc. I'll give this a couple of seconds if you guys want to participate. There's really there are wrong answers, but you can answer however you like. The point is to kind of show you how easy it is to get confused with mushrooms. And I'll just take a couple when you have them, Milo.
Okay, we've got one guess of BAC.
Okay, well, that is actually the correct answer, so let's go with that. Good job. So yeah, kind of what I highlighted here purposefully is to show you A, which is pretty innocuous looking. That's actually Amanita ocreata, one of the two really toxic mushrooms that you'll find in California. This one is native here as opposed to the death cap, which was imported from Asia at some point. And of course, you have the bright blue or purple bluet, which is edible. One of the few examples of blue or purple mushrooms. That's not a color that you see very often. And then you have turkey tails, which are very common here. Some people do boil them and eat them. I can't imagine that they're very tasty. I've never had them myself, but they are commonly used as a medicinal mushroom. So again, it just goes to show that while in other places in nature, color and brightness can be an indicator to poison or venom, right? You have poison dart frogs, for example, or certain salamanders. Snakes are tricky, right? Because some of them are bright when they're toxic and some of them are not. But in mushrooms, there's just about zero correlation between the brightness and color or how funky they look and whether they're toxic or not. Again, it's really common to have really plain brown, reddish, or white mushrooms that can be super fatal and toxic, and much brighter, more interesting looking things that are actually perfectly fine to eat. So the point is, you never can know this about a mushroom going in. You really have to do your research. Here I show you some examples of what you can see in California. You can find all of these depending on where you're at in the time of year. So I'll start here in the top left. You have black trumpet mushrooms. And these are a type of chanterelle, edible and very delicious, kind of a pain to clean, but and they're hard to see. They often just look like holes in the ground if they're not sticking up too far, especially on brown substrate. You have a gemmed puffball here, or a common puffball here. You can see all the little dots, those little gems. That's edible as well. Here you have a cocora. This is an example of an amanita that is edible. Again, I personally avoid amanitas. I'll explain why later, but you know, they're just too similar looking to really dangerous mushrooms. Here and at the bottom, you have boletes. These are a mix of king and queen boletes, I think. So these are the famous porcino or porcini in the plural. Here's cauliflower mushroom, a little old. That's why it's getting kind of dirty, but this is a great one. It also, if you cut it, it'll grow back every year. Same with oyster mushrooms, which you can see here on this tree. Candy caps right here in the middle. These are a fun one, especially for beginners. Candy caps kind of smell strongly of maple syrup. In fact, people often make ice cream and cookies out of them, so really pleasant. This is a California chanterelle, which is a type of golden chanterelle, choice, edible, really sought after, probably my favorite mushroom to eat. And here's another bluet in the bottom right. Here are some examples of toxic mushrooms that you can find, some of them in California. Again, we've got the Amanita, this is the fly agaric, or Amanita muscaria. Comes in red. It also can tinge orange or yellow. I believe there's even an almost pure white varietal, but these are toxic. They won't kill you, but you won't have a good time. They're definitely going to upset your stomach, cause a lot of vomiting and stuff like that. Here are the two important ones in the middle. If you don't remember anything else out of this class other than don't eat random mushrooms, it's definitely stay away from these two. This is Amanita phalloides, the death cap mushroom, recognizable by the fact that it's got all the morphological structure of an amanita. You can see the egg there. And it's kind of got an olive tinge to it. That's one of the trademark tells of a death cap. And then again, you have Amanita ocreata here, the destroying angel, which is mostly white, but very deadly. I can't name all these other ones. I know there's a gallerina in there, less common and not as mistakable for other things. So yeah, again, this isn't meant to be exhaustive or all inclusive, but just some examples. Of course, some mushrooms are psychedelic. Interestingly, the Amanita muscaria is both. It's both toxic and psychedelic. One misconception about psychedelic mushrooms is that what's happening is that you're being poisoned. And so when people, you know, have reactions to them, what's happening is it's your body fighting off the poison, but that's actually not true. The psilocybin and psilocin, I think there's a couple of different substances here that are at least in, sorry, not in that mushroom, but in what you see at the bottom. And what you see in the middle, that's psilocybe cyanensis, the wavy cap there in the middle. And I think that's the golden teacher there in the bottom left. So yeah, they do affect the functionings of your brain and can cause hallucinations, et cetera, but it's definitely not you being poisoned. So again, these are things that you need to know what they are, so you know what to stay away from and what's potentially dangerous. So here's kind of a summary on principles on foraging identification. I tried to keep this mostly visual and low on text, but these are important, so I wanted to make sure that I had a backup to what I was saying. So yeah, so like I said, find someone who has experience foraging and that you know well and trust and that can kind of teach you about mushrooms if you want to go out and start learning about them. Understand the area where you are foraging. You kind of want to know what grows there mostly. Are you around, you know, oak, tan oak, eucalyptus? You know, again, because of that symbiotic relationship, different mushrooms grow around different trees. You'll see redwood forest has totally different mushrooms than an oak forest, for example. So you want to really understand what's going on and what you're looking for. Learn the toxic cousins. I'll have a slide that covers that in just a second. It's hard to identify mushrooms in the field just randomly, but if you are looking for the chanterelle, for example, it's really easy to learn the other two mushrooms that kind of look like a chanterelle, but that might be toxic or even fatal, and you learn the specific differences between those two mushrooms. It's almost like a, can you tell the difference between these two pictures kind of exercise? It's kind of like that. When you see them side by side, it's actually pretty easy to tell the differences. Ask questions. There are tons of groups online that can help you ID mushrooms. There are tons of people like me and of much, much higher experience. Some are mycologists. You can get memberships with mycological societies and go out on official foraging trips. There are about 1 million different ways that you can learn more about mushrooms, do it safely. and educate yourself to the point where eventually you can have, you know, a nice plate full of mushrooms in the winter and make dishes and be proud of something that you went out and foraged yourself, which is really exciting. Anyone who's ever gone hunting or fishing, it's a similar concept. You just don't need a gun or a fishing rod. Check your references, right? Again, there's books and sites, and it's always good to kind of cross-reference things. Even when I've gone out, this was a forage that Milo and I did here. We've got a bunch of chanterelles, black trumpets, and hedgehogs, and that was only half or a third of the haul. So that was a really lucky day where we picked a lot of mushrooms. We still kind of double check those mushrooms very carefully, check our books, even though we're experienced and we've eaten them plenty of times. We make sure that, you know, you're not sneaking in something dangerous. Don't eat anything you're unfamiliar with. Again, until you have a lot of experience, you really shouldn't be eating any of the mushrooms that you pick. ID using multiple features. Usually if you can get 4 or 5 macro or micro features, and some of them are secondary, they're not related to the mushroom directly. So for example, was it growing out of a tree or out of the ground? That's a big subdivision into what it could possibly be. You're not gonna find an oyster mushroom growing out of the ground. Usually they're growing off of wood. And then, you know, color is iffy because as mushrooms get older, colors can fade. And while under a microscope, spores of a specific species will always be a certain color, the mushroom itself will not always be strongly in that color. So color can be a good thing as a group of identifiers, but it's never a good identifier by itself. Pick whatever you like as long as you don't eat it. So if you want, I do this all the time. If you want to pick a few mushrooms that you find that are different, take them home, cut them in half, take pictures of them, go through a mushroom book or go online and see if you can identify it. It's really fun. You know, it's like an investigation. And again, you can put them on Facebook and mushroom groups, and there's lots of people that will come out and say, oh, it looks like this or it looks like that. And while I wouldn't trust any single person's identification online, it can point you in the right direction. And then you can go, oh, okay, this is an Amanita. Now I can go to an Amanita book specifically, or just a general mushroom book. I'll give you some references at the end. Speaking of Amanitas, I avoid eating Amanitas. Probably something Milo taught me, but in general, everyone has a different level of risk. I know that if I avoid Amanitas, I'm basically not going to eat 2 of the really deadly mushrooms in California that I'm most likely to encounter. So it's an easy way for me to be really safe because I know that if I screw up in another species, most likely I'm going to have a stomach ache from it, but I'm not going to need a liver transplant. So again, it's just a matter of risk. Take pictures by all means, whether you want to take pictures of the mushroom in situ or whether you want to pull it up. If you are taking pictures for identification, it's important that you take some pictures up close and you want to get the whole structure in the cap, as well as it's important that you get under it and look at the gills. So if you're not going to pull it out, use a flash, get a picture of the gills, or if you are going to pull it out, then again, later at home, you can cut it in half. That's always really helpful for identification. Here's an example of lookalikes. So you see a California chanterelle on the left of your screen. And then an example that I found of Western jack-o'-lanterns, which are really cool mushrooms, but they are toxic and will make you sick. Mine were older, so a little bit darker orange. You can see on the far right an example I found on the internet of something that looks a lot more similar, at least in color, to the chanterelle. These also supposedly glow green in the dark, but you can only see it on very young specimen that are full of spores. And usually you need a long exposure camera to expose it because it happens kind of slowly, but that's kind of a cool fact about jack-o'-lanterns. Again, chanterelle grows out of the ground, jack-o'-lanterns grow out of wood. So that's another good thing. Here's why I don't pick Amanitas. The Amanita on the right, spring Amanita, or Kokora, I think it's also called, perfectly edible, supposedly delicious, etc. Mushroom on the left, death cap, you will almost assuredly need a liver transplant, and a couple of people die from eating these every year. As you can see, first of all, in these pictures, the remnant of the veil that you see here, I don't know if you can see my mouse moving, that could very easily also be on this death cap. This death cap in particular just happens to not be showing veil, and I can actually see the top of the egg here that kind of broke off cleanly or opened cleanly. So it probably doesn't have any remnant. That doesn't mean that it couldn't look like this. So in the end, the only difference between these 2 mushrooms is the color. And again, if they're out in the field for a while and they age, that color difference may get more and more vague and they might look even more similar. So again, a good example of why I do not eat Amanitas, although I will pick them and ID them to get more familiar. Here's a cool one, kind of a very alien looking mushroom. This is in the stinkhorn family, and these were growing right in my front yard a couple of winters ago in wood chips. Often when you bring in wood chips, you're also importing mycelium unknowingly. And so these witch's eggs, as well as they're called, were growing. And I kind of went through a process of washing them and taking the layers off. You can see the one split in half here, shows you what looks like roots, but really that's the mycelial thread that kind of popped up and then grew the mushroom. And you can see the compressed mushroom before it comes out. And then you can see the full grown mushroom here, at which point is no longer edible. They're kind of funky. That's why they're called stinkhorns. These mushrooms have kind of a slimy, wet portion at the top that turns black once they've sprouted completely, and they spread their spores by attracting flies and then having the flies land on them, and then the flies fly off with their little wet feet. So that's why they're smelly. They're trying to attract carrion insects. But again, cooked in some butter and garlic, these are pretty good. A little on the funkier side for people who are not super experienced. But again, it was a really cool process to catch something myself and be 100% sure what I was doing. Here are other examples of mushrooms that I've picked and cooked. This is a chicken of the woods here on the top left. Oyster mushrooms, which I then battered and fried. Those were really good meat replacement too if you're a vegetarian. They're really hearty and full of protein. And here are some boletes. Again, this was a trip I did with Milo, I believe. So yeah, there's a little bit of medicinal use to mushrooms. I'm not an expert and I don't use them medicinally. I think that a lot of Asian communities do. So if you go to a Chinatown and go to like a pharmacy or even their grocery stores, they'll have tons of dried mushrooms and they'll grind them up into powder, make tea out of them. Ask the Chinese community. They know a lot more about medicinal mushrooms than I do. Here's a couple of references. I got to show you this one, Milo. It's an old book from Berkeley from like the 1970s, I think. And my mom just picked it up at a thrift store and it's really, really cool. It's great for kids, especially very simple, hand drawn. I forget. Oh yeah, Ronald Russo. And I looked him up and he was like a member of the Mycological Society for a long time. David Aurora's Field Guide and his main book here, who were really, really famous. This California Mushrooms book is great, full color as well. Here's a couple of web references. Another example I use, this is not my own photo, although I have found these, but that's a bird's nest fungus there in the middle. And you can see just how different it looks from other mushrooms. It literally has these little seed pods in the middle that look like eggs that then shoot out. And I imagine there's spores in there, but just so completely different from anything else. And then here I have a mosaic of a bunch of different mushrooms that I collected up in Northern California, and you can see the variety, everything from what looks like a fried egg here to little tooth gills to corals that don't even look like mushrooms at all, but they are a fungus. So again, the idea is to show you kind of the diversity of color and form in the fungal world.